Good afternoon. Boa tarde. Boa tarde. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to speak with you here in the Assembly. I very much appreciate being invited by the Assembly and Bússola Tech to be at this absolutely fantastic event. It's already exceeded my expectations. I hope it's exceeded yours. Let's hope it doesn't go downhill from here. But it has been absolutely wonderful to be here and to be invited here and to experience the wonderful hospitality both of the Assembly and Natal in general. For those of you who didn't make it here first thing in the morning yesterday, I'll introduce myself again. I am Andy Beattie. I am the Chief Parliamentary Counsel for the Scottish Government. That makes me the head of the Legislative Drafting Service in Scotland. Until recently I had another role. I was the President of the Commonwealth Association of Legislative Counsel. That's an organisation that represents and promotes cooperation between over 2,500 legislative drafters in over 50 countries and well over 100 assemblies and parliaments. It promotes and improves legislative standards, and between them those parliaments and assemblies draft the laws for almost a third of the world's population, from some very small Pacific islands to very heavily populated nations such as Nigeria and India. There are Commonwealth countries in every continent, including Guyana, not too far from here, in South America. It's the only South American Commonwealth country, but Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean, not far from here, has one of the strongest legislative drafting imprints in the Caribbean. So I have had the great privilege over a few years of being able to gather knowledge and information from literally all around the world, and that's why it's so fantastic to be here today in Brazil. I will focus my presentation, not least because I was asked to, on modernisation efforts in Scotland, but obviously they have been influenced and reflected by some of the experiences I have had from around the world. Over the 25 years that I've been involved in lawmaking, I've seen significant shifts in how we draft legislation, but I think more importantly in how legislation is used, and even more importantly by who it is that uses it. One constant for me, I think, is this. I believe that lawmaking can always be better. I've always been enthusiastic about finding ways to improve how legislation is written, how it is made, and how it is used. So today I will share a few of the key initiatives that we've been undertaking in Scotland to modernise legislative drafting. I'll explore how generative AI is starting to change that landscape. And I will conclude by reflecting on some of the leadership challenges and the approach that's needed to guide reform and modernisation in this space. But let me perhaps just start with some background. Parliamentary Counsel, or Legislative Counsel as they're called in many places, are the drafters of laws. In my office, the Parliamentary Counsel office, our main role is to draft the bills for the Scottish Government, which is the Devolved administration in Scotland, though we do also draft some bills for members of the Scottish Parliament. We draft bills for the Law Reform Commission in Scotland, and because of arrangements we have with our colleagues in the UK Government, members of my team can get involved in drafting the Scottish aspects of some UK legislation. We are based in Edinburgh, up there, Scotland's historic capital, a wonderful city. If you've not visited, you're all welcome. Just look me up. I'm more than happily share you around. It's also the site of Scotland's modern Parliament building, which is down in the right-hand side there. It's actually situated right in the heart of the historic centre. We are civil servants. We're not political appointees. We serve whichever administration the people elect. We're guided by civil service values, which are integrity, honesty, objectivity and impartiality, as you might expect. Scotland has been a part of the United Kingdom since 1707, so it's over 300 years. But despite that, even when Scotland and England united, Scotland retained its own unique and separate legal jurisdiction. So as a result, there is distinct Scottish law and a separate, distinct Scottish statute book. So we have a long history, as I alluded to yesterday, dating back 800 years. I have 800 years of statutes in the office in Edinburgh. For nearly 300 years from them, all Scottish legislation was enacted by the UK Parliament in London, where of course there was Scottish representation, but that changed in 1999 when a Scottish Parliament was re-established, I have to take care to say re-established, in Edinburgh, with powers in devolved areas. I'm not sure if devolved translates very well, Lewis says, but it's actually not accurate. Where Scotland, the Scottish Parliament has powers in non-retained areas. So when it was set up, some areas were reserved or retained by the UK Parliament, including things like immigration and some social security. But basically anything that wasn't retained, the Scottish Parliament has power to legislate and to create primary legislation on. So lots of the big social issues you would expect, health, education, justice, environment, they are all within the powers of the Scottish Parliament. At the same time, new legislatures and assemblies, parliaments were established in both Wales and Northern Ireland, although for various reasons not in England. England does not have its own parliament, unlike the other nations of the UK. That's another long story, which I will not trouble you with today. But suddenly we had a new and modern Parliament building. It was operating, albeit in one of the oldest and most established legal systems in the world. As I said, it's based in this really impressive modern building. It was designed by a Catalan artist or architect, Enric Morales. Like all public buildings, it wasn't without its troubles, but certainly in my view, it's been a fantastic thing for us to have. Will was reflecting yesterday on the sort of importance that Parliament buildings have, and actually some of our discussions just today and yesterday has made me reflect on that there are lots of very, very traditional parliaments and assemblies all around the world, and I wonder if that does have a particular impact on modernisation. Certainly, my view, by having this wonderful new Parliament, it has given us a real opportunity to be at the forefront of parliamentary modernisation, and it's allowed a more creative and innovative ethos to thrive, unencumbered, I think, by some of the chains of historical parliamentary precedent. So thanks to colleagues for pointing some of that out yesterday. It maybe really spring to my mind. But no matter where you are, as I say, I've been to parliaments and legislatures in every corner of the earth nearly. I'm sure Brazil is no exception. It's thought that the ability to enact high quality legislation is fundamental to democracy. Laws need to be clear, predictable and fair, and easily understood by citizens. I mean, this is very much what protects the rule of law. And also, by drafting laws to the highest standard that are needed to maintain civilised and well-governed societies, in itself that secures the reputation of both governments and parliaments for making laws that serve their citizens well. It brings me just a little bit to the question of what is high quality legislation, and that's quite often what I'm asked to talk about, so I'm going to give you a little summary of that. Again, most of the assemblies and parliaments I've worked with have remarkably similar definitions of that standard, with variations of the theme on seeking to make laws that are precise and easy to understand. In Scotland, we have a high standard of making legislation that's clear, effective and accessible. The need for legislation to be effective is self-evident. A statute must be unambiguous, precise and robust enough to deliver the policy even when placed under intense scrutiny. But while technical efficiency is essential, clarity and accessibility are equally important. A law, for it to truly work and succeed in the practical sense, in the real world, it must be easily understood and easily found by everyone who's affected by it and everyone who wishes to use it. While some, and I have to say, including many generative AI tools that we use, still assume that legalese is an essential aspect of legislation, it's almost universally accepted in the legislative drafting profession that choosing language that is plain and simple is critical to good drafting. It seems obvious that a law which is clearly set out in simple language and is easier to understand is more likely to be followed. Just a little story on that. A few years ago, I was drafting a law, and a very preeminent lawyer in Scotland came on the television and reported that he said that modern Scottish legislation looked as if it had been written by young children. He did not mean this as a compliment in any way. It so happened I was drafting a law which was happening to incorporate the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. And it occurred to me that wouldn't it be quite wonderful if the children who it affected could actually understand the law. So, being a drafter, I managed to take a compliment from a criticism. But certainly, the biggest change in I have to say, well over a quarter of a century now of drafting legislation is the audience who reads the law. And it's why the concept of legislative accessibility is increasingly important. The vast majority of legislation is now viewed on the internet, of course, and the consumers are very different to what they were certainly 15, even 10 years ago. Having the statute book online and law now in the form of structured data as well as words means that we're able to monitor how often people look at legislation, what they look for, when they look for it. The most common entrance into our statute book is not going to the source. It's certainly not going to the books. It's actually just using Google. Google search is the way that most people access laws that we write. We know that millions of separate visits are recorded on the government's legislation website every month. When lawyers were once almost the sole readers of the statute book, it's now much more commonly accessed by non-lawyers going about day-to-day business. People like council officials, police officers, even citizens looking for how the laws might affect them. And this really reached a peak. We found this reached a peak during the COVID pandemic, when everyone was going online to read what we were writing late into the night about how close they could stand to somebody, when they could go out, what they could do. The public were going straight to the legislation to read it, and it had a real peak. And that far-reaching change in readership has been one of the main drivers for changes in what would look set down on paper or even goat vellum. We now think about how long it would look on the screen on a laptop or even on a mobile device. I'll confess myself, I probably read more legislation on my own phone than I do everywhere else. And that's starting to have an impact on how we write it. Constant digital development coupled with ever-changing readership seems likely to continue to exert an influence. So the transition of legislation from being words on a page to also being data has been transformational in our sort of modernisation agenda, both in terms of how it's made and how legislation is used. And I can share with you some of the ways that that's helped us to pursue innovation in Scotland. As a start, I'll begin just talking a little bit about how we developed our guidance on how best to draft legislation. We've published a version called Drafting Matters. You'll notice I have a badge with Drafting Matters. We're very proud of it. That's perhaps the only reason I'm mentioning it now. It's practically the only bit that I designed myself. Although I think its content does demonstrate a modern approach to drafting, the reason I mention it now is actually to explain how we prepared it in a collaborative way using digital tools. We used quite simple, Microsoft tools, but it was created in the style of a collaborative wiki, with all the drafters in the office generating and commenting on the drafting guidance to form a collective view on the topics. The collated input was brought together for publication, and we continue to evolve and develop it collectively using collective tools. As I say, the technology was by no means revolutionary. I mean, at the start it was just a basic SharePoint. But I mention it because doing this some years ago importantly introduced my team to the benefits of using new digital methods to co-produce material, of continuing improvement, of shared responsibility, of trying things together. It changed the way we work, and it really set the scene for the bigger challenges that lay ahead with us. Now, one of the most important of these, and which I'll probably talk most about today, is something which is called Lawmaker. This is bespoke software which we develop and used, and it's changed how the way legislation is drafted, amended, and published. The Lawmaker project is actually a collaboration between Parliamentary Counsel, the drafters in both the Scottish and the UK governments, so we're the drafters of legislation, but also the Scottish and UK Parliament, so two parliaments, who oversee obviously the parliamentary progress, and the National Archives, who publish all the legislation. It was recognised from the outset that legislating is high profile and critical for both parliaments and governments involved. The room for process failure in legislation, we know, is small, and this is why parliaments all around the world have over time developed sophisticated, usually paper-based processes that have evolved to enable elected members to debate and scrutinise legislation in a way. We recognised at the start of the need for a new digital-first approach. The project sought to create a new digital system which each partner could use to build the core tools that they need. It required either drafting, scrutinising, amending or publishing legislation. The project built a new overarching tool that allows legislation to be shared more easily throughout the entire legislative cycle, and improves how the resulting laws are then made publicly available on the official legislation website. It adopts the Acoma Natosa open data standard, which you've heard about, and it was developed using a browser and cloud-based tools. So the project enables each partner to create and use and manage legislative data to suit their own needs. It allows partners to engage more seamlessly with each other throughout every stage of the legislative process. It provides opportunities to make the legislative process more accessible for the legislators, for the members, for stakeholders, and to make the law more accessible to the public. And I'll say a bit more later on how we're now exploring how to integrate generative AI into this to improve the system even more. By using open source components and working in the open, we adopted agile methodology and did this all while meeting the security requirements of 5 different partners. The project gained the benefits of a common collaborative approach. It used partner feedback to determine development priorities. It helped each partner to secure improvements from the contributions of owners, and also, of course, by having a shared system ensured much better value for money. Using the agile methodology to develop the software was not without its challenges, that's for sure. And there were certainly times where some partners were more drawn to the waterfall approach, as it were. But particularly when testing was being done in the live legislative environment, obviously there's nervousness about trying stuff out in live legislation. But engaging users in development throughout the process most certainly led, ultimately, and certainly in my opinion, to the creation of a much better end product. As a result, in Parliamentary Counsel, the drafters, we have a new tools for legislative drafting. They have lots of things which we asked for in the development process. It does all the cross-references. We can drag provisions around and it changes all the cross-references around. We can cut and paste from our own statute book into a new bill, and it automatically it takes the XML and just reproduces it in bill form, so you can just start from an existing bill. It produces consolidated prints whenever you want for comparisons. So these were lots of different things which drafters asked for. But of course, when we're finished drafting, we press a button and the cloud somehow magically opens up, and the clerks in the Parliament then have access to the document. And they, as part of the development process, ask for lots of things for themselves. They're interested in how amendments can be processed, so it works. So, we still draft amendments in the sort of traditional way, leave out this, put in that, and they can be then sent to the Parliament. They can then press a button and it automatically updates the bill without them having to manually update the bill. Similarly, you can do it the other way, in that you can go into the bill, revision mark it, as you traditionally do in Word, press a button and it will create a suite of amendments which can then be lodged in the Parliament. The clerks of the Parliament also had, as you would expect, lots of requests about how it marshalled and ordered amendments for debate, and it does all that. When all that's finished and we're through the parliamentary process, someone, I think probably the clerk or the presiding officer of the Parliament, presses a button and it's accessed by the National Archives, who then have the same document with the same legal XML data, which they can then publish. And as part of the development process, of course, they had lots of requests of how that would be set out so that they can make the final law more accessible to the public. The use of open source components meant that the code created potential to be used to shape future digital developments in other parliaments, other assemblies. And over the past year, the project has actually been extended to be used in another legislature, the Northern Ireland Assembly. And plans are in place to explore whether the Parliament in Wales, the Senate, can be used next. So having the national and subnational, can you use that word, legislatures develop the new software together has had many advantages. Efficiencies have, of course, been secured, and involving more partners at the development stage meant we all benefited from the others' input to designing the tools. So our colleagues in the UK Parliament, our colleagues in the Northern Ireland Parliament who are drafters, they had their own requests, but actually it was like the unknowns. They said, well, wouldn't this be good for drafting? And my team hadn't thought of that. Oh, that would actually be great. We would like that too. So by having all the different parliaments and assemblies develop this together, it should also prove very valuable for the publishers in the end, because all the parliaments ultimately publish the laws for the UK. So it all comes to them in the same form of data, so they can publish it all together and have links and different methods, which of course makes the law much more accessible to citizens. So that's Lawmaker, which is the most thing. There's a couple of other things which I wanted to mention. One, and this is just a different tack, but this is something which is called Guidance on Instructing Council. Common Legislative Solutions, this project was called. And now this is something that grew out from recognising the power of viewing legislation as data, structured data, as well as words on a page. And it was the development of guidance on, as it says, common legislative solutions. It sprung out of work which the publishers, the National Archives, were doing to research patterns. They called them common patterns, which occur in legislation. Having transposed the whole statute book going back 800 years into data, the archives were able to identify commonly occurring patterns across the statute book. They identified patterns in the data. In other words, what they saw was common solutions to frequently occurring policy questions or problems. So examples included things like creating criminal offences, framing powers of search and entry, establishing new public bodies, or setting up new licensing regimes. The legislative data showed that all the legislation doing these things followed or shared a similar legislative pattern. So then, having identified those patterns, the Legislative Council and all the different drafting offices across the UK worked together with policy officials in our own administrations to produce guidance on how to draw on these common legislative solutions to develop legislative policy in these areas. In particular, the guidance draws on policymakers' attentions to detail, so it draws them to matters which they should always consider before legislating in these days. So if someone wants to set up a new licensing regime, so for example, at the moment one of the things people are, how do we license or regulate cryptocurrency? Rather than do that from scratch, we have a sort of guidance on all the licensing regimes that have ever been created. Here are the common features. And we've managed to do this by scraping the data out of the statute book, and it's been a real fantastic resource because it allows particularly inexperienced policy officials to have a sort of starting crib sheet. This is everything which I should do before I instruct Parliamentary Counsel on how to draft a bill. So I said I would touch on AI, and I don't really want to come here without doing this. I'll explain this in just a second. Generative AI. There seems little doubt, as I think we've heard all throughout the past couple of days, that generative AI will likely have a huge impact on how legislation is prepared and interpreted in the future. I have organised and attended numerous legislative events all around the world over the past few years, and certainly since ChatGPT was launched in December 2022. I've been in Jamaica, Tanzania, India, Australia, Canada, the UK. All of these events have included huge debates about the opportunities and, of course, the challenges that AI brings. It's fair to say, as I think we've consistently heard over the past couple of days, that no one has yet had very much success in using generative AI to actually draft legislation. The dangers inherent in using AI are part of the problem for this. For example, I think we're all aware, the risks of importing societal prejudices, misogyny, or homophobia, or racism, sort of inherent in society. AI has no vision for that, so it imports all that into the writing. From a legislative perspective, back to what I was saying earlier, by using large language models, presumably targeted at legal writing or perhaps the whole statute book going back 800 years, generative AI still seems to be, we find it hard to stop it, assuming that legislation should be drafted using old-fashioned legalese, the sort of language that most legislative drafters moved away from many years ago. I mean, even before I started. So reverting to that style of legislation that AI is currently producing now would actually be quite a big step back. And this slide here is there to demonstrate this a little bit. And I think sometimes using AI for visual purposes helps with this. What I did simply was I said, I asked ChatGPT to say, can you produce me a picture, please, of some legislative drafters at work? And this is what it came up with. So it caused me to reflect just a little bit. The first thing I did, and just to demonstrate that point, is everyone's using paper and pen. I mean, again, even back in my day, we weren't using paper and pen. So it suggests that drafting is something old-fashioned. It also has a lot of diversity in the picture, and I asked it about, oh, you're showing a diversity, and obviously doing a lot of work in the Commonwealth, there is a lot of diversity in drafting. But it then explained to me, oh, I'd done this not because that represents the reality, it represented what the aspiration was for legislative drafters to be diverse. So I thought that was very interesting. So I then said, oh, can you perhaps draft something a bit more real and reflect how drafting is actually done now in both Scotland and Brazil. So it came up with this. This was the next iteration of the two pictures. We are now using computers to draft. There's no tie in one of the Scottish pictures, which I was reflecting on yesterday. That is perhaps more accurate to modern life. One thing it perhaps does about drafters is, in both the pictures, in both sets, it does have people collaborating. And that is actually something which is quite new in legislative drafting, when we've always tended to work a little bit with pairs and stuff and working together, and especially in jurisdictions where there's bilingualism, people work together. But actually, our tools, for example, our new lawmaker tool, one of the great things it does is it allows lots of us to work in the document at the same time. There is much more collaboration together. So actually it gets that right. That's something modern. But one of the reasons for putting the pictures up and them not being accurate is I think actually using AI to use pictures sometimes, we talk a little bit about how it can be 80% or 90% accurate. I think sometimes when you see that in words on the page, it's harder to detect. If you see a picture that's 80% accurate, somehow your brain quickly detects that there's something not quite right with it, quicker than it does a sheet of paper with words on it. And I think that's just an interest. But I do wonder if it is, that's perhaps why it's still not producing legislation. I mean, on top of all this, of course, we know that there can be issues with accuracy and transparency, and there are issues with security and confidentiality that make the use of AI far from ideal at the moment. But, again, as I mentioned yesterday, the phenomenal pace at which Gen AI is improving from the first iteration a couple of years ago, ChatGPT itself is already much better. Although, like most places, we're now starting to use Copilot. I expect it will only be a matter of time before it's more than capable of producing what I might describe as credible legislation. Now, I'm not saying that's good or perfect legislation, something that's credible. And as I've heard, that presents opportunities. Perhaps allows drafters to have early drafts and opportunities to spend their time actually thinking about the difficult things. But it also clearly produces challenges. For example, for the parliamentary process, we already know that Gen AI can produce amendments to bills, for example, in huge numbers. I think someone was talking about Italy earlier. I did hear about one example in Italy where it was used to produce almost 1 million amendments to a bill, just for the point of slowing the parliamentary process down. And the more credible that those options are, the more that they are, they can be used. That is a risk. But at the moment, what we are particularly interested in is what outcomes we can secure by using the AI tools that are available. Again, as I mentioned yesterday, it's important not to lose sight that AI is not for us. It's not for lawyers. It's for the people. We can sometimes get quite bound up in how AI can affect our work. Will put us out of work. Can it help us do this? How can it help us for good or bad? But I think we should retain focus on what is it producing. How can it enhance accessibility and usability of the law for our citizens? So we're focused at the moment certainly on how AI can be integrated into our lawmaker software to make legislation more accessible and easy to understand. The project team are exploring how Gen AI tools can make use of the data that's set into Lawmaker and published online to enhance the understanding and accessibility of legislation. We're developing quite a few prototypes. A few people have talked about how to develop and integrate AI, and from talking to I'm by no means the tech expert, but from talking to the people who helped develop this, it's quite interesting their experience, which I think some others have shared, is taking the AI tool and creating something add-on. Actually using the AI is actually quite a small part of it. Developing that tool, 90% of it is still what you usually have to go through to create any sort of IT system. AI is just not this magic thing that you sort of drag into it. But there are some things which it can already do. I mean, it's already, as we can see, incredibly effective at incorporating amendments made across the statute book to prepare updated versions of legislation. We call them Keeling schedules. I think Wade called them something else yesterday, but it's really good at, if we produce a bill that amend other acts, our members always ask for updated versions of how it looks, and we've produced tools that can do that with multiple sets of amendments. They can see whichever version, how it will eventually look in the statute book. It's also, we found, really quite good already. I was surprised how good it is at producing what we call explanatory notes or memorandums, which is just to explain in normal language what the legislation is already doing. We had some great early success just with Gemini and ChatGPT, and again, they're now working on prototypes as to how they can do that. It might be, as we were discussing earlier, I mean, our office prepares those amendments, that it produces something sort of 80% good at the touch of a button, which will clearly have efficiency savings across the Commonwealth, where there are huge amounts of multilingual jurisdictions. It's obviously also very good at or getting increasingly better at translation, not to the point where it can do it, but where it's there. So, beyond that, AI, so will it change everything? Our role is to ensure that we're not left behind and to consistently encourage and promote modernisation. So if you let me finish, I'll perhaps just finish with a few words just on a slightly different topic, which is how do we lead and encourage change in this space. Oh, I had a final slide, but it's not up there. Huh. I'll come to it. It was a quote by a Greek philosopher. You can't come and talk about law and democracy without mentioning Greece. So I'll just quote it later. But as I said, making law is a critical part of any functioning democracy, and the processes around doing so are understandably robust. Introducing innovation inevitably brings uncertainty, which can be threatening or worrying for institutions or individuals which are accustomed to expect very high levels of certainty and reliability. And the quote which I had up there, you probably still had one of the old versions of my slides, is that the only constant in life is change. A really good quote. It's a good way of getting people to accept and embrace change and to adapt it. Another quote along these lines that I like is, although not every change is improvement, if there is no change, there can be no improvement. Another sort of classic. Embracing change is therefore essential for modernisation, but none of this happens without strong leadership and cultural buy-in. So perhaps just share a few of the 3 lessons that I've learned. First is the importance, again, others talked about this, about empowering, encouraging and supporting your innovators. I am by no means an innovator. The Lawmaker project, one of the deputy drafters in my office was a very keen IT enthusiast called Matt Lynch, and I have done my best to support him through many years, through thick and thin really, to try and get that project to the point it is now, where I certainly think it's an absolutely wonderful tool. And it's even more important if, like me, you're not a technical expert, because the temptation to be cautious and risk averse is strong. But it needs to be heeded. Project leads are at the forefront of innovation, and they need to be empowered to pursue their most creative ideas. And the second thing I would say is just embracing collaborative agile design. We've heard talk about agile methodology. I mean, we found it to be hugely beneficial. It ensures that the eventual users, including and particularly, perhaps especially those most reluctant to change, are involved in the development and testing of new products and approaches, accepting failure as part of the innovation process, and using feedback to secure improvement for the final product. It produces better product and better aligned to the needs of what you're actually going to do. And finally, I think it's important to be understanding and supportive of colleagues who are being asked to change their ways of working, to listen carefully to their concerns, to ensure training and support is available at all times. And as a leader, I think it's very important to communicate clearly and frequently and again what the ultimate vision and outcome is intended to be. Leading change is not easy. Again, we've heard a few others say that. But we have certainly learned that by establishing a culture of continuous improvement and an acceptance that change is a necessary part of improving, that we can secure the behaviours that are needed to do that properly. One of my other, I could perhaps steal one of Ornella's slides as my last slide, because one thing I was going to say is that continuously improving how our laws are made and making them more understandable and accessible to our citizens is not a technical challenge. I think you had a slide saying that. It absolutely is not. It is absolutely critical. As you know, we most certainly not should see it as technical ways to benefit how we are, but we should see it as how we can develop tools, modernise and improve when we make laws for the citizens that we serve. It's an absolutely essential part of a well-functioning democracy, and it's why I'm continuously enthusiastic about it. So thank you for listening. Muito obrigado.